Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for Visual Journalism on the Edge. My name is Matt Seklecki from the School of Communication at American University, and I just have a few housekeeping items before we begin tonight. Tonight's event is being recorded, and we will share the link to the recording in the next few days with all of you and everyone else who's RSVP'd. Participants' audio and video will remain muted for the duration of the event. You can pose your questions to our panelists using the Q&A feature on the toolbar in your Zoom window, and closed captioning is available. And so now I'd like to introduce the moderator for our discussion, Sue Morrow. And she is an advocate for visual journalists as a picture editor, designer, and art editor. She's been a newsroom leader at the San Jose Mercury Times, Tampa Bay Times, the Sacramento Bee, and the Boston Globe. She believes everyone has a story to tell. Media is the powerful medium to report those stories. Sue is the editor and designer for News Photography magazine for National Press Photographers Association. Sue?
Thank you very much, Matt. It's good to be here tonight. And welcome everybody to Visual Journalism on the Edge. It is hosted by the School of Communication at American University. Thank you for joining us for this discussion that will explore the challenges facing journalists today, especially visual journalists, working in today's divisive environment. It's a necessity to be present to report, but we are very challenged in today's exceptionally divisive environment. And we want to discuss these things tonight and how to counter and cope with the new challenges. I'd like to welcome our three panelists, and while I'm doing so, pictures by Bill Gentile and Maranie Staab will be shown. I need to warn the viewers that they will see some pretty graphic images over the next few minutes. They might be triggering and upsetting to some. The images are by Bill. They were made in the 80s in Central America. So let me introduce Bill real quick. Bill Gentile is an independent national Emmy award-winning journalist and documentary filmmaker. He teaches at American University School of Communication in Washington, D.C. For 4 decades and over 5 continents, he has covered revolutions and civil wars in Central America in the 1980s, and more recently, he's covered conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Let me turn this over to Bill, and he'll talk through these photographs.
Hi, Sue. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thanks for moderating the event this evening. I spent a lot of time with soldiers in Nicaragua during the 1980s. Of course, this was the height of the Contra War. The U.S.-backed Contra War. The previous slide that you saw was the aftermath of an ambush by Contras. These are Sandinista forces, the men standing up here. The wounded in the previous image were Sandinista forces as well after after they were ambushed. You know, I've never been to Vietnam, never covered Vietnam, but I've been told by Vietnam veterans that the conflict in Nicaragua was very much like Vietnam in the sense that it was a series of ambushes and surprise attacks, much like these guys are doing here. This is the Simón Bolívar Battalion of the Sandinista People's Army. There were very, very few frontal, like, you know, a large force against another large force in sustained battle during this war, which took about 35,000 lives in Nicaragua. And that's in addition to the 30,000 people who were killed in 1979 during the Sandinista Revolution, which I covered for United Press International. These pictures I made for Newsweek magazine. Go ahead, Matt, let's see another one, please. The dead people here are Contras, the living people are Sandinistas. This was during an incursion by the Contras into Nicaragua in a northern village, and you know, they got caught up by the Sandinista People's Army. Next, please, Matt. You know, this is the way the Sandinistas, you know, got their wounded out of the mountains, and sometimes it took days to carry these guys out. They take their hammocks, which are, you know, nylon sacks for coffee beans, cut down a tree, sling the hammock in between the, you know, the 2 ends of the pole, and carry the wounded out on their shoulders. And some of them survived, many of them did not. This is El Salvador. I spent a lot of time in El Salvador. This is one of the exclusive neighborhoods in the capital of San Salvador. And Frank Smyth, who's on this panel, Can talk with you more about that. But this was, imagine fighting in downtown Washington, D.C. or any major city with weapons like these guys are using, firing at each other from block to block. It was a very, very dangerous endeavor to cover this. Go ahead, Matt. We're back in Nicaragua now. This is a Sandinista militiaman who was killed by the Contras. That's his family back there, his wife, his two kids, his mom dressed in red, and his father dressed in the blue shirt on the left-hand side. Go ahead, Matt. And that's me. I think this picture was made in like 1984 up in the mountains by a really, really accomplished photographer, Maranie Staab, who at that time was working for the Miami Herald. So it was a dangerous part of the world to be living and working in. Having said that, the media there were given some immunity, some level of immunity, simply because we worked for major news outlets and there was some respect, some regard for the media. That has changed, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Go ahead, Sue. I think that's the last picture in the series, is it not?
Okay, we're on to Maranie. Welcome, Maranie Staab. Maranie is an award-winning independent photographer, videographer, and journalist, currently based in Portland, Oregon. Her work focuses on human rights, social justice issues, social movements, displacement, and the impact of conflict on individuals and society. Maranie, tell us about these photographs.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me this evening. So these, I think the first few photographs are from just earlier this year, January 6th, what started out as a MAGA Million March and what is now known by most as January 6th, or the insurrection. So one of the sentiments that we've been feeling, we being like a lot of the press on the ground today, is just an anti-media or an anti-press sentiment. And this was one of many signs that we saw that day that expressed the press is the enemy of the people, or and there were more than one attacks on that day, and I think most people, or a lot of people, have seen the footage where tens of thousands of dollars of equipment was destroyed that day. You can go, yeah. So this is also from January 6th. I was there as a videographer working with a colleague of mine, and I don't think anyone really expected this to happen, but this is right after, a few people initially broke through, were able to get up the stairs, and then kind of for the next several hours, individuals were climbing up the stairs and the scaffolding, and then climbing up the wall as shown here. Go ahead, Matt. Yeah. So for the last, well, I guess it's for the last year plus much of 2020, myself and a lot of visual journalists, whether photographers or videographers or even print journalists, spent a lot of time covering protests in cities across the country. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I started covering the protests there and in Syracuse, New York, where I was a graduate student at the time. And then this came out to Portland in July. Hearing about the feds being in town and about the assaults, what really interested me was what I was hearing about increasing number of assaults on journalists. And so that previous image was one of many examples of a night where the Portland police were often dressed in riot gear, and tear gas and or pepper spray was being used rather indiscriminately, both on protesters and press. This image is from earlier this year in Colombia. Colombia, I think it was April and May. It was sparked by, a proposed tax reform. And even if that was rescinded, even after that was rescinded, the Colombian people took to the streets countrywide, and there were reports of journalists being killed, primarily in this town called Cali, but also in Bogota, where I spent most of my time. And like in Portland and a lot of places, the more violent and I guess inherently dangerous protests took place at night like this. This image is back in Portland, kind of just last year was tough. A lot of us have talked recently just about like almost kind of unbelievable what was experienced on the ground, both what we saw happen to others and then also experienced ourselves. I am the person speaking here today, I guess, of my generation, but I'm far from the only person that has experienced violence on all fronts and intimidation on all fronts and obstruction of the press on all fronts, just over the course of this last year and a half. This is back in Colombia. Yeah, they being the protesters pictured here were shooting fireworks at what was called the ESMAD, which were the equivalent of the riot police. And this was me sitting on the ground and just hoping and waiting for the right moment. I should say that after seeing Bill's photograph, I have like shooting film, I can't even imagine. So Matt, so much respect for people that worked during that time. Go ahead, Matt. Yeah, this was in 2017. This was in Mosul, Iraq. I was there in May and June of 2017, kind of ISIS's last stand, and I was embedded, really just staying with a medical team that was purportedly there. They were supposed to be there, you know, treating soldiers that were injured. But what ended up happening is coalition airstrikes, and the US-led coalition airstrikes were using drones to try to kill members of ISIS, and they may have been getting their targets, but they were also getting thousands of civilians. And so what we saw were a lot of injured and dead children and families. Go ahead. Yeah, this is from the same incident. Probably still like one of the toughest things I've ever experienced. But I think it's important for people to see. New York Times did a great report a few years after, I think it was a few years after this, but it was called The Uncounted, about how we as a coalition owned up, or, you know, acknowledged several hundred civilians were killed, where the number was between 9,000 and 11,000. Yeah, this is the same 6-week period, plus or minus. This is, you can see the feet of a young girl. Her name is Zainab. She was 7 years old at the time. That's her mother and another sibling, and we're on the way to a hospital. She did not make it. And yeah, this is a picture of me, kind of one of many examples of close calls. It's a military. Didn't own a gas mask until I moved to Portland, Oregon. It's a military grade gas mask. And what you see there is I was shot in the eye with, I think it was a pepper ball or the equivalent. There's a lot of different less lethal munitions used, but I'm pretty confident I would have injured or lost my eye had I not been wearing that mask at that time. And I think that's the last slide.
Thank you, Maranie. Okay, our third panelist is Frank Smyth. He's an independent, award-winning investigative journalist. He's a former arms trafficking investigator for Human Rights Watch. He has testified on press freedom before Congress, and he is the founder and CEO of GJS, the leading US-based hostile environments training firm. Okay, we're going to jump in here, and I've got a little intro, but why am I moderating? Okay, I've been a career picture editor, and it's gotten much harder, certainly unsettling, to send photojournalists to places around the world, and quite frankly, to news events domestically in the United States. And what journalists have faced in the 1980s is far different than what we face now. Most recently in August, Reuters photojournalist Danish Siddiqui was killed covering fighting between Afghanistan security forces and the Taliban. And we continue to have colleagues in Afghanistan whose lives are at risk daily as they currently report and photograph the news. But domestically, where we are labeled enemy of the people, disinformation threatens how journalists do their jobs. which has led to physical assault. And this started a while back. So we're going to discuss this. So I want to start off with Bill. Bill, based on your experiences from Central America and in the 80s, and even after that, how have you seen things change for photographers like Maranie, who cover nightly protests in Portland and have to wear gas masks and have to suit up every night? Yeah, pick it up here and just I'm going to let you guys go for it. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, I covered the 1979 Sandinista Revolution and the Contra War for 7 years, from 1983 to 1990. And I never wore, I didn't have any protective equipment. I didn't have a helmet. I didn't have a flak jacket. I didn't have, protective goggles. I didn't wear any of that stuff. In Nicaragua, the press was pretty respected, and Nicaraguans, it's part of their character, I think, that they didn't mind having photographers around, where they soldiers, civilians, or whatever. Salvador was a bit different. Salvador was a very, very dangerous place for everybody during the 1980s. As a matter of fact, between 1979 and 1984, 18 journalists were killed in all of Central America, covering these conflicts. 12 of those 18 were killed in El Salvador. A couple of my friends, who I had the great misfortune of having to help pull them off the battlefield, died along the way. But even in El Salvador, there was a certain level of immunity by the forces of power, by the army, by the police, by the death squads, because they were kind of aware that you don't mess with journalists. It's going to cause too much bad publicity. They help create our image on the international stage, and we don't want to look like bad guys. We want to look like good guys. Of course, a lot of times that slipped up. They made, they killed nuns, they killed priests, they killed civilians. So sometimes that rule didn't always stand. The big difference that I see between then and now is that it's the people, the protesters, that actually come after the media. I mean, I think that sign that Maranie showed at the beginning of her presentation was really indicative. Something like the media is the problem. The media is the virus, I think it said, and a lot of people believe that. And this whole notion of enemy of the people and fake news. These lies are propagated by the cowards who would never go out and do the kind of work that people like Maranie do. And this is problematic for everybody. At American University, I teach young men and women to go to places like Central America and like Portland, Oregon, to do their job, to search out the truth, whether it be, with film or with video, and so that the rest of the world can be informed. I mean, if it's not us, the journalists, then who is going to do this? But the big difference is now, for the first time, the people that we're covering actually turn on us. And this is a really, really serious change. And it means one of my greatest concerns is that one of my students or young people like them is going to really get seriously hurt out there in the field for just doing their jobs. And this is something that we have to push back on really, really strongly. Professionals like me, professionals like you with the NPPA magazine, and the practitioners themselves. And people like Frank Smyth, who's on this panel.
Well, I can pick up where Bill left off. I think also, besides the world getting more dangerous and getting more dangerous for the press around the world and in the United States, which the latter is not something I was expecting to the degree we've seen in the past couple of years, is that everybody is working with less, or most photojournalists are working, and videographers, many of them are working with less institutional support, especially if they're working overseas, than before, right? There are a lot of videographers that may work for newspapers domestically to do multimedia stories, but the people overseas are really on their own, like Maranie. And that creates problems in terms of how do you get health insurance? And I know among journalists, it's the photojournalists who tend to operate often without insurance or without adequate insurance. And this compounds the risks of getting injured. And groups like A Culture of Safety have worked with insurers to try and create affordable insurance, but the payout isn't that large either. So if somebody were seriously injured, the benefits, the level of care you would get down the road if you're incapacitated for life would be minimal. And it's also clear that these people without institutional support are freelancers, and they're not just Westerners. They're increasingly local journalists from the nations that these conflicts are occurring, in the United States, of course, but also around the world. I know there are a lot of local journalists who I believe are watching this event. And they're also working with, you see more of their bylines, right, with names that don't seem Western to me in the New York Times and elsewhere. So I think that the mainstream media in the West has gotten over the notion of being so exclusive in terms of who they deem are worthy of reporting for them or filing pictures, recognizing that the West has no monopoly on objectivity at all, right, if it ever did, right? So that goes out the window. But it means that everybody's working, or many people are working on their own. And that is a problem. And a culture of safety and others are attempting to meet this challenge through training and support and providing insurance, but we're still behind the curve. And I think a lot more needs to be done, especially since I think things are heading worse, not better.
Maranie, I want to follow up on that.
I guess there's a lot I could say. Is there anything you want me to tackle specifically, or?
Well, we have a comment, and I'd like to kind of combine a comment to a question.
Sure.
Bill had mentioned that, yes, a lot of the protesters are the ones that are pushing media to the edge. Well, there's a lot of other forces at work here too. There's law enforcement. There's political administrators. There are political leaders. We all know this. How do we push back? How do we collective journalists, how do we push back? I mean, I can go into this all day long, but I want to hear from you. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. So I see it as three primary fronts, for lack of a better word, where journalists are really under fire, and both, whether it's physical violence or online threats. So that'd be law enforcement being one of them. And I really want to be like very clear. I guess I'm just uncomfortable at all, like being about me. I have so many colleagues that have experienced the same or worse. So I guess I just want to emphasize that this is widespread. This is not just Portland or DC or New York. This is everywhere in this country and in other countries as well. I think it's just more unprecedented, the level of violence against the press we're seeing in this country. So it's law enforcement. And then especially here, we see a lot of what we call the quote far right. And there's a large anti-press sentiment there, mainly that, we're fake news, or one that I get a lot is I'm Antifa press. And then less so, but also increasingly, there are people on the further left, again, for lack of a better language, some anti-fascist protesters or anarchist protesters who operate under belief that we do not have the right to film them, irregardless of whether it's on a public street. And if we continue to film them, equipment will be broken and/or persons will be physically assaulted. As far as what we can do, I think none of us like being the story, and I have gotten some flack for that, but I think it is important that we talk about this. It has to be known, because I've had just as many people say I had no idea that this was happening. So I really think the first thing is it needs to be widely known that this is an increasingly dangerous occupation. And if that happens, and ideally you'd get public support behind that, those that actually, pull the levers of power could make it so that we could prosecute police officers who knowingly assault journalists with impunity. Because if those in power wanted things to change, I do believe they would. It just needs, I think the word is impunity. There's a lot happening where people know that there will be no recourse.
That's a very good point. You know, we've seen more attacks against the press in the United States since the death and the murder in police custody of George Floyd, May 25th, 2020, than we've seen ever before. And we've seen increasing patterns of police arresting journalists under false pretenses, also then throwing on a charge of resisting arrest, simply to get them to stop reporting, to stop journalists from documenting often use of force against protesters, which police don't want televised, right, or documented in any way whatsoever. And we've seen attacks on journalists themselves, like Maranie is talking about. And the ultimate problem that I see is that as we've been attacking institutions in this country from all directions, one of the institutions, or one of the things that's been eroded, is faith in freedom of the press. That I don't give a damn, you know, I disagree with what you say, but I defend your right to say it. That very American notion, what to me is a quintessentially American notion, or so I've thought through most of my 60 years. Now I realize really isn't held by necessarily all that many people. And that is a real threat. That's a threat going forward to our democracy and our ability to have pluralism and have it be sustainable, right? And I think we've got to address this. And an ACLU filed a lawsuit against Minneapolis police for their false arrest of journalists last summer. There was a recent suit filed against New York City police, which I think is good. I think these need to be pursued. But what we really need is to have more dialogue where people across the political spectrum, such as people from MSNBC to people to Fox, agree on the notion of press freedom and disseminate that to their viewers and their audiences. And that I don't think is happening. Because when we lose press freedom, we get authoritarianism. And whether you're afraid of authoritarianism coming from the left or the right, press freedom, pluralism, and the rule of law is what upholds all of that. And it seems like people have taken that for granted and really forgotten it. And I'm not sure how to jumpstart that conversation, but somehow I think we have to think about that.
It's a really complex problem, and I understand that. And I think there's got to be, we've got to somehow, attach a monetary component to this whole issue. And that's where like they said during Watergate, follow the money. To follow up with these lawsuits, I think that they can be effective because of people concerned about getting sued. I think there should be boycotts of some of the media outlets that are not telling the truth. I think it's got to be a grassroots effort and a multifaceted effort to straighten this situation out, because I'll tell you, I've never seen, on January 6th, we came really close to losing the whole thing, to losing the entire ballgame, I think. And I'm afraid that we're going to see more of that. And if we're not prepared for more of that, and with some defense mechanisms in place, then who knows what the hell the next generation is going to look like.
Yeah.
Kind of building off of that, I think it is a top-down thing to some extent, like the monetary aspect, of course. Like, just because I'm here, I'm going to say, like, the Portland police, I think they just paid out 50 grand for the second time. But there's also like a queue of, I would be surprised if it wasn't hundreds of lawsuits against the Portland police. Like, it will take time, but they have been and probably will continue to have to pay. At the same time, when you are, to take January 6th, when you have the President of the United States, while you're standing there as a member of the press, saying you are the enemy of the people, and when you have 4 years of essentially just eroding what was like this institution that has historically been respected, and with that respect, comes the protections. That was, I don't know how you undo that damage other than having, leaders, whether it's the president and or other public leaders, make it a priority to reinstill that respect and the protections that come with the freedom of the press.
Part of my concerns in how do we push back? By the way, those questions that I kind of combined, one was by Jan Sotomayor and Jesse. I don't have a last name. Thank you for sending those in. Start sending questions in. This is a good time. How do we push back? My level of concern goes directly, just like Maranie said, to the top. the leaders of newsrooms, the leaders of your workplace. And I know this is tough for independent photographers, but it's all about the contracts you sign and how they support you or not. I can tell you that the National Press Photographers Association, also known as the NPPA, if you're a member, you have access to two of our attorneys, Mickey Ostraker and Alicia Calzada. They are remarkable, available to journalists in trouble. They've helped journalists get out of jail. They have helped in lawsuits against law enforcement, multiple, particularly over the last 4 years. And that's one of the incredible components of the NPPA right now. Unfortunately, it's incredibly needed, but fortunately we have them. And I just want to put that out there in case people don't know it, because the NPP advocacy work is phenomenal. And we continue to build on that. That is one of the ways we can push back. But what about newsroom leadership and across broadcast, across newspapers, across radio? It's like, that's where the support comes from.
You know, I know Mickey Osterreicher from NPPA, and he is great and been an extraordinary advocate. And he's been looking at these cases longer than I have. And we've had many conversations over the years. And I don't know Alicia, but I'm sure she's great as well. I think newsrooms and editors, even if they are mindful, and I think the great many of them are mindful about the interest of press freedom and being responsible with the people that they're working with, are also working with limited budgets. And if they try to push too hard, they're going to get the pushback from the guys with the carpeted offices, as a boss of mine at CBS used to say, and say, you know what, forget it. We're not going to cover Afghanistan. We don't care anymore. We can just pick it up off the wire. We don't need to cover this. And I think that's the challenge we face. And I'm not, I think news organizations should be responsible, and I'm part of the community that is demanding that they be responsible. But I also recognize that there's a limit. They can be responsible by just not sending anybody and not having to pay for it. And I think that's one of my greatest fears. And another thing about this, how can we push back, is somebody wrote, Jason Meyer. One thing that I would like to see, and this is proposed by the Committee to Protect Journalists during the lame duck period after the election before Biden was inaugurated, for Biden to appoint the first special envoy for press freedom that the United States would ever have, right? It's been bannered around and been part of that discussion. That's never been, one has been appointed, right? We have one for religious freedom, but now I think would be a good time to start addressing some of the things that Maranie was saying, like trying to drum up bipartisan support. Look, press freedom is good for everybody. You don't want to silence people. You don't want to attack the press. You want the key to bad press is more press to help bring the truth to light, right? I mean, that sounds almost quaint now, but it's something we've got to defend and revive. And Biden, he's got a lot on his plate, and he's had I think a somewhat rocky start, but that's something that I would like to see the administration move on. And it's possible that could happen depending on how things go in terms of who's going to become the next Assistant Secretary for Human Rights.
Here's a good question from Scott. Do you think the attacks against the press hinge on the idea that there are so many, in quotes, citizen journalists or fringe groups who are calling themselves journalists, who are not credentialed members of the press working for established media companies?
Yeah, I'll take that one. There's been I don't know if it's just Portland, but there has been a lot of this fake press sentiment. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there have been and are protesters who will label themselves press as a way to, in the hope that it will bring them protections. However, the amount of indiscriminate and disproportionate violence by law enforcement that we saw last summer, to me, it really, that in that incident, it didn't matter necessarily. So I don't absolve anyone for this, for the again, the level of violence against people that I saw repeatedly night after night on the streets. I think that at a certain point, that I will give law enforcement this, there might have been a level of frustration not being able to delineate. But again, there's no excuse in my mind, in my opinion, for what we saw out there. I do think that people that blur that line do a disservice oftentimes to this institution of press. I don't think there's any, I mean, I'm a proponent of, we have a right to, and I think it's important to have cameras and people out there making video. I mean, this is all, it's documentation, it's evidence, and it's also their right. But if you're an activist doing that, then you're an activist doing that. You're not necessarily a member of the press. And I think people take issue with that and push back. But it's not meant to be an insult. It's just like, they're two different things.
John has a comment. Assaults on press from either left or right are not susceptible to dialogue. These groups have no interest in institution of a free press. In parentheses, I'm a photojournalist and have experienced all of these assaults. Yeah, that's a big statement.
Well, yeah, and I know, John, I saw that comment. He's one of my beloved colleagues out here on the street. We've all been out here together for the last year or so, and he's exactly right. And I think Jan also commented, like, the kind of response we get if we try to push back in the moment with the police. I mean, unless you've seen the videos, and anybody can reach out to me if you haven't already seen them, but they're also very Googleable. Like, unless you've seen them, like, the police will respond with violence and or arresting you and or making you stand, 2 city blocks away, which is, we're unable to do our jobs at that time. I mean, I'm one of many that was arrested last year for interfering with a peace officer. That was ultimately dropped because it was shown that he lied completely on the police report. And then as far as we've all tried, whether it is with protesters of any side or, whatever the protest is about. But it either ends up in continued obstruction. Like, we've had people just stand with their hands in front of their cameras. We've had people physically try to remove us or successfully remove us. Many of us have been physically assaulted and or had gear broken. So we're all humans down there trying to do our best. A lot of us are independent. Some of us are out there not even on assignment, we're on spec. So when it comes down to it and you're someone's screaming at me, I'm gonna try to engage with them. We're not robots. And I just think that press is seen as, by some people, is seen as just I actually don't know, but I'm someone that will always try to engage, but it goes nowhere.
So I've seen that, I've seen you, but I've also seen you not respond and stand your ground. And I wonder how you do that, because it can't be easy. It's intimidating. And so I kind of want to bring Bill and Frank back into this, because the differences that you guys see now, I mean, would you guys be out there doing this right now?
I'll take that for a bit. I've always thought that journalism is such a necessary endeavor. I mean, journalism, journalism is more than just a craft. It's more than just a profession. Journalism is a way you embrace life, and it's a way that you deal with life. I feel every time I go out to make whatever, whether it was covering conflict in Central America, going to Iraq with a bunch of soldiers, most of my work has been done overseas. And I find that really, really rewarding, because I thought it was most necessary to do the work there. But it's a privilege for me to go out and tell people's stories and to join this global conversation that we call journalism. and I get great satisfaction out of telling other people's stories so that they can have a broader audience than just me. The answer to your question, I think, is yes. I would probably be going out there. I mean, just the same way that I evaluated every time I went out with a bunch of soldiers, every time I went out on a mission, every time I approached a firefight. Is this going to be something that I want to do? Is it worth doing this? What does my gut tell me? I can get really hurt here or worse. Is it worth it? And in terms of Central America, I thought it was worth it because it was my country intervening in those poor, underdeveloped countries. And I thought it was important for the institution, our institution, the media. I thought it was its job to investigate what was happening there and to report back to the people who support those endeavors, like American voters. I mean, that was the whole rationale behind what I was doing in Central America for a couple of decades. This has to be addressed by the institution that is designed to do so, and it's called journalism. Go find out what's happening and tell their stories in the hopes that larger forces, outside forces, can make lives better in a country where vast majority of the people live in misery.
Thank you.
And Frank, I had a curious question for Frank, actually. And sorry if I interrupt here, Sue.
Okay.
You must, in your training sessions with journalists, I imagine you teach journalists how to there are ways to respond to people, being aggressive around you. You can either confront them and then they have, 15 buddies standing around to help them, or you can try to cool the situation down. How do you do that? And do you teach that in your courses?
Yeah, we teach de-escalation techniques and escape techniques. We don't teach people how to duke it out, right? You're not going to learn it in 3 days, and that's not our role. And that is only going to make a bad situation worse.
Right.
But we do put people in repeated, and Maranie's taken the course, repeated stressful situations, whether it's performing first aid or whether it's a riot, where there's a lot of manhandling and near groping, right? Or simulated groping, and you've got to get away. And other situations where you're confronted by a crowd who's in your face, who's calling you a fake journalist, and you have to either de-escalate or get out, knowing that, this is not the place to have a civil discussion because the temperature is so hot and they're so heated that attempting to connect with them, unless you meet them on their level, but then you're in a fight, right? So we want people to learn how not to take the bait, right? And that means physically protecting yourself and the way you stand and protecting your gear, but not taking the bait and responding to, what is basically cowardly drivel in my mind. Yeah. Don't give them the satisfaction because that's not going to help you. And then get out of there as quickly as you can or as effectively as you can. And January 6th, two things that I remember. There was, I think, a journalist from one of the wires who was dressed all in black, right? And I think wearing a helmet. And he thought, well, they won't think I'm a journalist. But then they thought he was Antifa, that he was taking pictures of them or taking pictures for law enforcement. Is all the video that was taken, that was closed caption, everything else ended up being used against them. And they went after him, and then he say, hey, I'm a journalist, and but it's better than being Antifa in that case. And I think he was okay, but that was very hairy because there's footage of people chasing him. Wow. And then you saw that the press decided, the TV crews, we're all going to put our gear in the same place, right? And we'll be protected. And I talked to some very experienced high-level security advisors that we've worked with who were there. And they said at a certain point, they just had to abandon the gear because it was clear that, attempting to defend the gear was going to get people hurt. And everybody there recognized that is not worth it, right? The gear can be replaced, but that was thousands of dollars in gear. And I'm not crying for the networks, but anybody who's a freelancer who got their gear destroyed is really out thousands of dollars they can't replace.
Yeah.
So yes, we train for this, but I'll be the first person to tell you, Bill, that training only improves your ability to mitigate risk relatively marginally, because what you need is the rule of law to be applied. And when you have police that are attacking the press, protesters, right or left, and mainly lately right, attacking the press with impunity, police attacking press with impunity, the rule of law seems nowhere. And this is an escalation of attacks. I wrote a report last summer for UNESCO about attacks on the press and protests. It's escalating worldwide. So what's happening in the United States is not isolated. But the fact that it's also happening here really does not bode well for the future, right? So yeah, we give training to help people mitigate risk, but it's really about having a sense of not taking the bait and then knowing when to escalate, and always having a sense, well, I can still go this way if something happens, always being ready to move. And I've seen some confrontations, including involving Maranie, where you've handled things. I know you're one of our trainees, but you've handled things extremely well under incredibly difficult circumstances, neither rolling over, but not taking the bait. And that is, I commend you for being able to do that. And that is not easy. And often you get the stress reactions to all that later, right? Because in the moment, there's no time for panic, and there's no time for being weak, and there's no time for, losing it. You've got to stay focused, because that's the best way you're gonna navigate through that with minimal harm to yourself and hopefully and your gear too.
Frank, you mentioned the authoritarians using the same tactics overseas. Don't you think they take license from the United States, from the past regime, which created this whole idea, the whole notion of enemy of the people and fake news? I mean, you hear Duterte in the Philippines, you hear Putin in Russia, you hear people like Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua using precisely the same language. I mean, my sense is that, they take the lead from Washington, and they use, those tactics to silence their own critics in their own countries.
Absolutely. The last president gave despots around the world a gift, right? Go ahead and attack the press, because if the American president can do it, they can do it.
Right.
And we've seen escalation in CPJ and others have documented this, where they said, yeah, he did it, so I can do it. And that's in Latin America, that's in Central Asia and Russia, and that's in other parts of the world, right? The Philippines and elsewhere. And that is a real problem. It's part of a trend, right? And the notion that the United States is a beacon for democracy and human rights, wow, it doesn't look like a beacon anymore, right? To some degree, the United States still, I believe, has some role to play, right? Even though it's been floundering about what that role is. And the press is sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place in terms of this kind of pressure. And a lot of what we're being blamed for is people are not happy with their own situation, and they're not happy with the truth. So attacking the press is a cheap shot, but unfortunately it works. And we used to have more defenses, more collective defenses from other groups and institutions and people standing up for us in the United States and around the world. And that's not happening anymore, and it's, I think we need more training and more awareness and more working together too, because teamwork is also incredibly important. I don't care if you don't like the other person reporting. If they're having a problem with protesters or police, film those altercations, because that's one of our best defenses. We always tell people that.
And at a time when we need more reporting and more local reporters, there are fewer and fewer of them because of the cutbacks. I mean, the whole, I have a colleague who's working on a project about the demise of American journalism, like the corporate takeover of journalism, the decimation of newspapers around the country, the closing of bureaus around the world. I think it's a story that a lot of people don't really understand. People want to hear good information about their hometowns. They want to hear any information. They want media, but they're not getting it. They're just not getting it. And it makes life harder for everybody, I think.
Yeah. And besides those citizen journalists, you've also got these alternative networks, right? Which we used to think of, on the progressive side, Democracy Now!, and then on the right, Fox News. But now there's a whole ecosystem of them. And they're creating avenues where people can get all their news from a source that really is quite dubious, right? And they exist on the right and the left. And I don't think there's enough media literacy out there for people to understand the difference between facts and inference, right? And embellishment and analysis. And that leads people astray of all kinds. And in social media, it's so easy to find cheap, free information that will completely mislead you, but it somehow resonates with people, makes them feel better about their own views. And that is really, I think, more dangerous than the citizen journalists out there who may just really be trying to do what they think is right. We
Yeah.
shouldn't condemn them because, what is a freelancer but a citizen journalist with more aspirations.
Yeah. Tell me about it. I live 5 blocks away from the Comet Pizza House, where Hillary Clinton was supposedly running a global child prostitution ring. I've been there a couple of times, and the only thing that I saw is families having pizza.
Yeah, in the basement, there's no basement in the Comet Pizza.
Right. Crazy.
There's a nice passage by Anita in our question, and it's I'm going to paraphrase because it's long, but thank you, Anita. Bill must know how difficult and even impossible it is to work in Nicaragua right now. Who is reporting from there at the moment? No one, because it seems it is not worth the trouble. It breaks my heart because some bad things are happening there, but it's not an easy assignment. So international journalists are absent at the moment, but why?
It's a tough place to work because it's hard to get into Nicaragua. I mean, I haven't been to Nicaragua in 2 years. The last time I went was in 2019 to visit friends there and to do a story on the 40th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution, which again I covered. And I actually, I needed some information to finish this thing, this memoir that I just published. Shameless promotion here of my book, Wait for Me, True Stories of War, Love, and Rock and Roll. But when I went there, I had a really creepy feeling because I went to a big demonstration to mark the 40th anniversary of the revolution, and there were just too many people who were kind of looking at me from behind dark sunglasses out of the corners of their eyes. Nicaraguans are normally spontaneous and fun-loving, and the whole place was subdued. Don't forget now, this is about a year after, 2019 was just a year after, security forces in Nicaragua killed about 325 people involved in peaceful protests. A lot of them were students, civilians who had no criminal records and so forth. But journalists are being shut down. Media outlets in Nicaragua are being shut down. I think every possible competitor for the upcoming elections in November for the presidency are right now either in jail or in exile. Opposition politicians are scared to walk out of their houses because the security forces around. It's very, very, I know a couple of journalists who are still there, but to get major newspapers in there, like from the United States especially, I'm not sure that they can get visas to get into the place, or if they go to the place, if they can work freely. So it's a difficult situation. And the government there does not seem to be affected at all by international criticism, by urgings from other countries to, chill out. They want to be in power, period.
Yeah, there is some good reporting coming out of Nicaragua. Wilfredo Miranda just did a piece for El Faro about comparing El Salvador and Nicaragua, which I think is quite good, right? So there is reporting. But the other problem is, since the U.S. isn't involved, right, what makes a story in the United States overseas is often whether or not we're arguing about it in Congress, right? Which is why the Contra War, right, which had less total violence than either Salvador or Guatemala, but there was a constant debate in Congress over whether or not that war was worthy of U.S. support. Nobody really is focused on doing anything vis-a-vis Nicaragua, and therefore it falls off the map, like other parts of the world, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and mining and rapes of women and things like that, right? I mean, I think that's part of the problem, right? As we become, as news for news sake is less valuable, these stories that don't necessarily have a political angle or an angle involving the United States are not covered, right? And the BBC generally covers those better than most, right? Because they have a more equanimous sort of view of what news is. But that's something that's a problem. And as a freelancer, if you go there, you might get the greatest stories ever, but you'll have trouble getting them published.
Yeah.
Right.
You're right. There is some reporting going on. There was a piece this last week in the New York Times about how many political opponents of the regime are either in prison or exiled. A lot of them are in Costa Rica. And I think some of the reporting was done actually outside of Nicaragua. I'm not quite sure.
I'm sure it was.
But you're right. I mean, after the 2018, protests and the killing of these 325 people, there was a mass exodus of I think 2,000 people were injured, 60,000 people fled the country. The economy plummeted because of, Nicaragua was a great place and people love to go there. It's a beautiful country and the people were friendly. But it was a key supporter of the economy. It fell off the face of the earth. I went there, hotels were empty, the beaches were bare. There was no one there. No one wants to go to the, and I understand it's still the same way. No one's going to go there. So you're right. It fell off the face of the earth, kind of.
That's my fear about Afghanistan.
Yeah.
That we are no longer going to hear what's happening to women over there. And
Yeah.
I think that, so we're coming up to 7:30 and we're going to wrap it up here. Unfortunately, it's been a good conversation. We asked the question in the beginning, how do we push back? I'm not sure who asked this, but a lot of people in the Q&A said, how do we push back? And it seems to me, love to hear from each one of you before we wrap up, if possible. It seems to me you push back by keep doing the work, no matter what. So I thank you, Maranie, for keep doing the work, and Bill and Frank. Do each one of you want to comment to how we push back? It seems to be the theme here this evening.
Encourage Biden to appoint a special envoy for press freedom. That's an actionable thing that I think would be of value.
Can you repeat that first part of that, please?
To push the Biden administration to appoint the first special envoy for press freedom in the history of the United States. It's been bannered about. I know I think they've considered it, and I think that something he could do that would allow for a partial restart, at least, of the conversation about what is press freedom and why does it matter.
Good, Frank. If you would, man, could you send me any information about that? About the fact that this thing is being discussed? Send me a link or two, whatever.
Yeah, and I can find days if I can.
Frank, are you on Twitter?
Yeah.
Would you mind putting that out on a Twitter?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Great. To answer your question, Sue, I try to push back as a teacher now, and I continue, I continue to make films. This book is pushing back. The pilot episode of my series on freelancers pushes back, and I push back in the classroom as well. So everything that we can do as practitioners, as teachers, as experts like Frank can do, I think there is a growing consciousness about this. Frank mentioned the ACOS Foundation. It's a London-based organization. It's kind of an umbrella organization for a lot of these institutions that are pushing back. The Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting is based here in Washington, D.C. They're doing a terrific job with education, with coverage, with giving students fellowships and grants. I'm a member of the Overseas Press Club Foundation Board of Directors. They're doing a great job in training young men and women to go out there to work as journalists. So it's happening, but I think there's not enough common knowledge about what's happening. People like Frank and I know, and you, because that's our business to know. And maybe we can do a better job in getting this information out as well.
So there are good things happening. Maranie, you want to wrap this up?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I'd like to see press freedom depoliticized, if that's even possible. I got some comments with the comments about, January 6th, and while former President Trump's rhetoric over the course of 4 years was very destructive, it is in everyone's best interest that we have freedom of the press. It is ideally something that we can become united about as citizens of this country. It is in everyone's best interest that there is a free and healthy and functioning press. And I think that starts with, I don't want to be redundant, but education, civic education, ideally from a very young age. It needs to be part of schooling. And then kind of, Sue, you said said it already, like, we need to keep the dialogue going. And then if you're in a position, like with the giant asterisk of please don't like endanger yourself, but it's a slippery slope. So if we start bending to the wills of those who wish to intimidate or obstruct press freedom, that's a dangerous and scary place. So to just keep doing what we're all doing. There's a lot of very talented and courageous people out there that I'm fortunate to know. So
Thank you. I'm going to wrap it up with a comment by Courtney. She doesn't have a question, but she wants to express her gratitude for everything you all do. I work with reporters every day for my job, and I have the utmost respect for your work. And I really hope the situation gets better. Thanks for sharing today. With that, I'm going to thank all of you, Bill, Maranie, and Frank, for this discussion. Thank you to our listeners and those questions who helped guide us through this conversation. Thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you to producer Matt Seklecki and to the School of Communication of American University, who is our host. Have a great evening, everybody. Hope to do this again one day. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Sue.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Maranie. Bye, Frank. Bye, Matt.
Bye.